Greetings. Welcome to our 15th episode of the FGI podcast series. My name is Tim Stark, and I'm a professor of civil engineering at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign.
And hello, everyone. My name is Jen Miller, and I'm the coordinator of the Fabricated Geomembrane Institute, or the FGI.
On today's episode, we are going to focus on identification, packaging, handling, storage, and deployment of factory fabricated geomembrane panels under ASTM D7865. Our special guest today is Mr. Andrew Mills, recently retired from the Layfield Group in Edmonton, Alberta, where he was the Director of Research and Development. Andrew was also the first president of the FGI from 2011 to 2017 and encouraged the development of test methods and guidelines for factory fabricated geomembranes, including ASTM D7865. Andrew, thanks for squeezing this podcast into your busy schedule and joining us from Edmonton, Alberta. We received a number of questions about handling factory fabricated geomembrane panels that I'd like to ask you and get your expert response on. So, Andrew, the first question: what are some of the advantages of using factory fabricated geomembrane panels?
Well, thanks, Professor Stark. I appreciate you inviting me in today. The advantages of factory fabricated geomembrane panels that I think of are a couple. First of all, it gives us access to a wider variety of geomembranes. When we go to fabricated, we have a broad palette of geomembranes that we can select from. It also gives us faster installations. Since most of the welding happens in the factory, we can go to the field with most of our welds already done, and that speeds up our installations. It also gives us an opportunity to do what I call drop-in liner systems, and a drop-in liner is a liner that has been made complete in a single piece before it goes to the field. That can be a flat liner for putting in an earthen containment. That can be a flat liner that would go into something like a secondary containment burn system underneath fuel tanks, or it can actually be a fabricated tank liner, which is dropped into an actual tank. One of the other things about fabricated geomembrane panels that's really advantageous is a variety of installation options. You can hire a professional liner installation team to come out and install your liners, but there are many situations where you can actually do things like self-install liners. Contractors who are working on your projects can also install the liners without requiring specialized installers, and that's because all the welds have been done in the factory. If you have a drop-in liner for something like a water tank, the water tank installer can actually drop the liner in and then finish the tank without having to bring out specialized installation technicians. One of the things I really like about fabricated geomembranes is there are some lightweight materials available that can give us some significantly lower installed costs. For things like water containment and irrigation, there are some of the least expensive materials available that are completely effective for holding water for things like irrigation and canal liners and things like that. There is higher quality seams because all your seams have been done in the factory. There's no rain, dust, wind, snow, or anything else that's going to give you problems. And then you're also not doing a whole bunch of destructive tests in the field because you doubt your welding ability. So by doing your welding in the factory, you take higher quality seams to the field. And then the last thing is, with fabricated geomembranes, you can do your fabrication all year round. So if you have a big project and you're actually looking at planning and scheduling your project, you can actually do your fabrication in the months leading up to your project, even if that is in the winter, so that you can do year-round planning and fabrication for larger projects.
Great, Andrew. Thanks. So what are some of the best labeling and identification practices for these large panels that you create in the factory?
Well, we go to the ASTM D7865, which talks about most of these things that we're discussing. And for identification, the trick here is to make sure that your identification of your panel is unique. Now, in many cases, that's a QC number or an actual job number. Whatever that unique number is, you need to use that number so that it connects to the fabricator's quality control system so that they are able to trace the materials that went into the fabricated panel. The other thing about identification is that you use a label that tells the user how to unroll and unfold the panel. This is important because when they take that package, which could typically be couple thousand kilograms or 4,000 pounds, they need to place that in the right location so that then when they unfold it, it will go in the right direction. So there needs to be some form of arrow or some kind of indicator that shows how the panel should be unfolded.
Okay, sounds good, Andrew. What are some best rolling, folding, and packaging practices?
Well, rolling and folding kind of define fabricated geomembranes. So we, in some cases, define fabricated geomembranes are those that can be folded and rolled. Now, the folding happens when you take the larger welded panel and you fold it to a narrower strip that you can then roll up to make into a package. And you need to fold things down so that you can get them into a truck for shipping. And then you will either roll them or you can actually fold them in the opposite direction if that's what's needed. The other packaging issue is then you wrap that with some kind of protective outer wrap. And one of the things that we always talk about as an important item is that you take another label and you put it underneath the package. And that protects the label from the weather, so in case the panel needs to be stored for a while.
Thanks, Andrew. So now that we have it rolled and folded and packaged, what are the best practices for handling these big panels?
Well, we need to take care in a couple of ways. First of all, the panels should be handled on pallets. The pallets should be relatively new and clean and unbroken, obviously. There can't be any nails sticking up out of the pallets or anything. And then usually we place a piece of protection between the actual liner panel and the surface of the pallet. That can be another piece of geomembrane, a piece of geotextile, or in some cases even can be plywood. So then we make sure that when we're handling these pallets, we use a forklift, first of all, that has the capacity to lift the pallet, but also with forks that are long enough so that it reaches all the way through, so there's no risk of the forks punching up through the middle of the pallet and causing damage to the panel. And that applies to both the factory and the field. In the factory, we want to make sure we package it correctly, and then in the field, we want to make sure we're using a forklift that's adequate for lifting and handling that weight of geomembrane once it gets there.
Okay, great. Another topic that we get a lot of questions about is storage practices, primarily in the field, but you could also discuss factory. And in the field, is there a limit to how long a factory fabricated panel can be stored out in the field? And what type of wrap should be used to protect the geomembrane panel outside at a site for, say, more than a year?
Well, there really isn't much of a limit to the actual fabricated geomembrane on how long it can be stored. What we're trying to protect, though, is we're trying to keep it clean and dry so that when we need it for deployment into a containment, that it's ready to go. So the actual trick to that is to make sure that we have a have a reasonable wrapper on it. Now, usually these wrappers are made from another piece of plastic. It could actually be a lighter weight type of geomembrane. There are different fabricators that will use different parts of different geomembrane types to wrap their materials. The company that I worked at, we used shrink film, which worked very well. There's lots of different ways of doing that. Just whatever that wrapper is, you need to pick that wrapper so that it will last for the anticipated storage time. Usually, if the wrapper is UV stable, you should get a year or two out of storage. If you have a problem with geomembranes that are going to be stored for a long time, then you can actually put additional tarpaulins over these wrappers just to keep the weather off. Mostly what you're trying to do is prevent the labels from fading. It's very difficult to print a label that has really good UV life, so you need to be able to see the labels in time for deployment. So protecting those labels from UV degradation, and as I said before, put a label underneath the wrapper so that it's not exposed to UV light and so it doesn't fade. Those are things that work really well.
Yep. Okay, so we've got it packaged and ready to go. Can you discuss some best transportation to the site practices? Is there a typical shipping weight for a fabricated panel?
Most fabricators can make panels much bigger than the people in the field can handle or even work with. So there's a typical shipping weight that's somewhere around 4,000 pounds, about 2,000 kilograms, that most fabricated panels tend to stay underneath. And this is affected by how the people in the field have the ability and the equipment to unroll and unfold that panel. So that becomes a fairly typical shipping weight. And then that panel is then folded and rolled so that it's narrow enough so that it will fit in the back of a van, fit in the back of a truck. Now, your best transportation here is to make sure that you ship directly to site. So if you can, on larger jobs, make sure you ship full truckloads that go straight from the factory straight to the site. That's your best practice. If you need to do a smaller shipment that goes on interline, you have to understand that the trucking company will tend to move these panels on and off trucks a number of times to get across the country. So you need to adjust your packaging to make sure that the panel doesn't get damaged, and that could include putting some extra wrapping around the outsides of the panels on the sides, or if a panel is quite expensive and has to go through a number of shipping steps along the way, you might even consider putting it in a crate.
Okay, great. So the package has arrived. How about some best deployment practices? And is there a temperature below which a fabricated panel should not be deployed?
Well, with deployment, we did mention before that your label is important because your label is going to show you where on the site that fabricated panel needs to go, because it's going to be made for that site. It's going to be custom made to fit that site. So if it's a single panel on a smaller job, there will be a particular place where you need to set that panel before you unroll it in the correct direction according to the arrows in the package, and then you unfold it in the other direction. If it's a large project with multiple panels, each panel will have an identification number, and each identification number will have to be matched up with whatever the final drawing is to make sure the panels are in the right locations. Now, as far as temperature below which a fabricated panel shouldn't be deployed, each material is going to have some limits. Some of the PVC materials typically are not deployed in cold temperatures, typically below freezing, but some of the polyethylene materials can be deployed in most any temperature, and then there are some specialty materials that are manufactured that can be installed in the coldest of temperatures. The advantage of a fabricated geomembrane is if you have cold temperature installation requirements, you can do your welding and your fabrication in the factory, and then when you go to the field, you can do your unfolding and unrolling, but you don't have to do any further welding. And so that will allow you to put a liner in the worst weather, terrible weather, and because you don't have to do welding in the field.
Thanks, Andrew. So now we have it in the field, ready to be deployed and so on. What are some best quality practices for factory fabricated geomembrane panels?
Well, most of the actual work on fabricated geomembranes is done in the factory. And so most of the QC is done on the seams that were done in the factory. And so we actually, the FGI, put together a practice for doing the QC on factory geomembrane panels, and it's D7982, ASTM D7982, and it talks about how often these seams are checked in the factory to make sure that they are adequate for the job on site. Once the panels are on the site, basically the panels are unfolded into position, and with a visual inspection, you can ensure that they're in the correct position. But unless there's welding done in the field, there is not any further QC required in the field. If there is welding required in the field, then check with your fabricator, because they will have their own field QC details that they can give you.
That's an excellent point. That, yeah, if there are no seams in the field, you don't need field QC, just factory. So that's great. Okay, two more, and then we're done. What sort of soil or subgrade preparation is necessary with these fabricated panels to prevent puncture under the applied load?
Well, Tim, there is another guideline for that. The FGI subgrade guideline is available on the fabricatedgeomembrane.com website. And if you look under guidelines and standards, you'll be able to find it there. And basically, we just say that the subgrade needs to be firm, compacted, and smooth without any rocks or debris in that space. However, the interesting thing about fabricated geomembranes is some of them are more resistant to poor subgrades than, say, a high-density polyethylene. And so there are particular projects where you can actually push the limits of subgrade preparation by using a fabricated geomembrane, which has additional flexibility and suppleness, which can accommodate a lot more difficulty in the subgrades. The other thing about subgrades is that if it's wet and you can't get it dried out, then you can actually use a one-piece liner and you can bridge over top of the wet subgrade, which is something you can't do if you have to be welding through the mud, which almost never works.
Right. Okay, last question that we received. Please describe the welding procedures for field repairs of factory fabricated geomembrane panels.
Well, field repairs will depend on the material type and the length of time the repair needs to last. Remember, there are geomembrane applications that are in fact temporary. So things like PVC-coated fabrics, of which there's many different kinds, polyurethane and CSP, that's chlorosulfonated polyethylene, all have special glues that are used for making permanent patches and repairs. Materials like woven-coated polyethylene use tapes for repairs. On other polyethylene materials like LLDPE, you can see temporary repairs made with tapes, but then there's more permanent repairs are typically made with things like a hand, hot air weld, and permanent repairs are made with special equipment called an extrusion welder. Now, each technique would depend on the application, and I suggest that you check with your local fabricator to find out more about that.
Thanks, Andrew. And that's all the time we have today. So, Andrew, thanks so much for joining us from Edmond, Alberta. And if the listeners have any questions or would like any additional information, please email me at fabricatedgeomembrane@gmail.com. That's one word, fabricatedgeomembrane@gmail.com. Or visit the FGI website at fabricatedgeomembrane.com. Andrew, thanks again, and appreciate all of your help during the formation of FGI and this podcast.
You're welcome.